It is 1890. A woman in London is 6 months pregnant. She has not left her house in 3 weeks. Not because she is ill, not because she is on bed rest, because she has run out of clothes that fit, and the culture she lives in considers a visibly pregnant woman in public to be a problem, an immodesty, a disruption, an offense to sensibility that polite society has decided to handle by simply not seeing it. She wears a loose wrapper at home. She has let out every seam on every dress she owns until the fabric is straining. She has a corset. She is expected to wear a corset, and she has been wearing it past the point where it is comfortable because the alternative is going outside without one, which is not done. She is not unusual. She is a perfectly ordinary middle-class Victorian woman experiencing a perfectly ordinary Victorian pregnancy, which meant experiencing it largely in private, largely invisible, entirely without clothing designed for the body she currently occupies. This is the story of what pregnant women wore before maternity clothes existed. And like almost everything in the history of what women have worn, it is a story about who got to define what bodies were appropriate for public view, and who had to hide. The corset is where we have to start, because the corset is everywhere in this history, and it is not a simple villain. By the 19th century, the corset had been a foundational garment of women's dress for several hundred years. It provided structure. It created the silhouette that fashion required. For many women, particularly those who did physical labor, it provided back support they found genuinely useful. The argument that corsets were universally oppressive and universally rejected by the women who wore them is a simplification. But for a pregnant woman, the corset presented an obvious problem. The body inside it was changing shape rapidly and continuously. Tightening a rigid bone structure around an expanding abdomen is, in the most straightforward biomechanical terms, not a good idea. What did women actually do? They let the corset out. They wore special maternity corsets, softer, with lacing that could be adjusted, which were available from the mid-19th century onward, and which were marketed not as a concession to pregnancy, but as support for the changing body. The premise was that the pregnant body still needed to be contained and shaped, just in a slightly more accommodating container. They also wore dresses with adjustable waists, garments with enough fabric and enough flexibility in the construction to accommodate a growing belly. These were not designed specifically for pregnancy. They were designed to be worn through a range of sizes because women's bodies changed for various reasons, and a dress that could only be worn at one exact size was a dress of limited utility. What did not exist was clothing designed specifically and publicly for pregnant women. Clothing that acknowledged a pregnant body not as a problem to be accommodated, but as a body that had particular needs and deserved particular consideration. The public dimension of this is where the story gets interesting. Victorian and Edwardian culture had a strong norm around what was called confinement. Not a medical term, a social one. The expectation that a woman in the later stages of pregnancy would confine herself to her home, withdrawing from public life until after the birth and a period of recovery. The practical reason for confinement was partly the lack of appropriate clothing. But the cultural reason was that a visibly pregnant body was considered immodest in public. The pregnancy itself, the evidence of sexual activity, the unmistakable sign of a body doing something intensely physical, was considered unsuitable for general view. Women were expected to manage their visibility, to fade from public life at the point where fading became necessary to maintain the fiction that pregnant bodies were not a thing that happened in public. This was not universal. Working-class women continued to work as long as physically possible. Pregnancy and public visibility be damned, because the alternative was not eating. The confinement norm applied most strongly to women who had the financial option to disappear. But the cultural expectation shaped what clothing was available, because there was no commercial incentive to design clothing for a stage of life that society had decided should be invisible. That changed in 1904. Or more precisely, it began to change in 1904. A dressmaker in New York named Lena Bryant, whose surname was misspelled as Lane on a business bank account, creating the Lane Bryant name by accident, had been designing custom clothing for women with non-standard body proportions. She had a client base of women who could not find clothes that fit them in conventional shops. In 1904, she designed what is considered the first commercially available maternity dress. It had an adjustable elastic waistband that could expand as the pregnancy progressed. It was designed not to disguise the belly, but to accommodate it, to create a garment that a pregnant woman could wear comfortably in public without the elaborate corseting and letting out and concealing that had been the previous solution. It was a radical act, disguised as a practical one. Maternity clothes debuted in 1904. And in an era of corsets, the Lane Bryant Clothing Company paved the way for women feeling comfortable as their bellies expanded. These weren't the stretch leggings and tunic tops we're used to today. The dresses simply had an adjustable waist. But compared to everything that had come before, that adjustable waist represented something significant. The acknowledgement that a pregnant body was a body worth designing for. Lane Bryant grew into a significant commercial enterprise, expanding into clothing for a range of plus sizes. The same logic applied more broadly, that bodies outside the standard commercial range deserved clothing designed for them rather than alterations of clothing designed for someone else. The maternity wear industry that followed grew slowly. It was not until the middle of the 20th century that dedicated maternity clothing became widely commercially available at multiple price points, and not until the latter decades of the century that the cultural norm of the visibly pregnant body in public became genuinely unremarkable. The woman in 1890 who has not left her house in 3 weeks is not a historical curiosity. She is the product of a system that had decided her body in its current state was a problem, sartorially, culturally, publicly, and had made no provision for solving it beyond expecting her to disappear until it was resolved. What Lena Bryant did in 1904 was not simply design a dress. She acknowledged, commercially and publicly, that pregnant women existed, were present, needed to go about their lives, and deserved clothing that let them do that with some degree of comfort and dignity. It seems like a modest intervention. Measure it against the 400 years that preceded it, during which the solution to the problem of a pregnant woman's body was to pretend the problem did not exist and it becomes something more. Subscribe if you want to keep following this. Every week, the history hiding in plain sight.